At 44, Sarah Whitmore made a decision that everyone around her called insane after the death of her parents. She was legally entitled to a fortune worth nearly $2 million, but claiming it meant years of ugly courtroom battles against the only family she had left. So instead of fighting for the money, she walked away with nothing. Friends said she'd regret it for the rest of her life. Strangers said no one in their right mind would abandon that kind of wealth. With only a few $100s left to her name, Sarah drove to a forgotten county auction and spent her last $150 on a collapsing 19th century horse stable that smelled of dust, rotten timber, and decades of silence. The auctioneer chuckled. A few bidders actually applauded, convinced they had just witnessed the worst financial decision anyone could make. They joked that the old stable wasn't even worth the firewood. For days, Sarah worked alone, hauling out broken stalls, sweeping away years of dirt, and wondering if they had all been right. Then, while clearing the floor beneath one of the oldest horse stalls, she uncovered a rusted iron ring hidden beneath packed straw. Moments later, a concealed trapdoor opened to reveal something that had been hidden from the world for generations. Something that would rewrite the history of the region's most celebrated champion horses. But before I show you what Sarah found beneath that forgotten stable, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment so I can say hello. And if you're starting your day with this story, I sincerely hope you have a peaceful, healthy, and wonderful day ahead. If you enjoy heartwarming mysteries, forgotten family legacies, and inspiring true-to-life storytime adventures, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community, because there are many more unforgettable stories waiting just ahead. Now, let's go back to the day Sarah walked away from a fortune and unknowingly stepped toward the greatest legacy of her life. Sarah Whitmore stood outside the county courthouse, holding a plain manila envelope that could have changed the rest of her life. Inside were documents confirming her legal right to claim nearly $2 million from a distant family estate after the deaths of her parents. Her attorney had explained everything twice. The inheritance was legitimate. The problem was that 3 cousins were contesting every page of the will. The case could drag through court for years, draining money, destroying relationships, and reopening wounds that grief had barely begun to close. Sarah listened as voices echoed from the courtroom behind the heavy wooden doors. Arguments had already become personal. Accusations replaced memories. Every conversation about her parents seemed to end with someone calculating property values instead of remembering the people who had earned them. She looked once more at the paperwork before sliding it back into the envelope. Then, with a quiet determination that surprised even herself, she walked into the clerk's office and signed the documents withdrawing her claim. The clerk looked up with genuine surprise. "Are you certain, Ms. Whitmore?" Sarah nodded. "I'd rather lose the money than spend the next 5 years fighting my family." The clerk accepted the papers without another question. A few minutes later, Sarah stepped outside, carrying nothing more than her handbag and the quiet certainty that she had chosen peace over wealth. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt frightening. She had spent nearly 20 years working as an estate accountant, carefully balancing ledgers, helping families organize inheritances, and watching people preserve generations of hard work. Now she had voluntarily turned away from enough money to guarantee her own future. Friends called within hours after hearing the news. Some pleaded with her to reconsider. Others simply couldn't understand. "You're walking away from a fortune," one longtime colleague said over the phone. "People spend their whole lives hoping for an opportunity like that." Sarah answered gently, "Some opportunities cost too much." By the end of the week, she had packed the small apartment she had rented after her parents passed away. Without the inheritance, she could no longer justify remaining there while searching for a new direction. She sold several pieces of furniture, donated boxes of books to the local library, and carefully stored family keepsakes in a rented locker. Her savings were modest. After paying outstanding expenses, she counted what remained. Just over $300. It wasn't enough to start over comfortably, but it was enough to keep moving forward. One rainy afternoon, she noticed a flyer taped inside the grocery store announcing a county surplus auction. Most listings included abandoned farm equipment, storage sheds, fencing, and neglected agricultural buildings scheduled for demolition unless someone purchased them. Sarah almost ignored it before one unusual listing caught her attention. Historic stable. Minimum bid $150. She read the line twice. The stable was located outside town on land no longer used for farming, according to the notice. The structure required extensive repairs and was considered unsafe for livestock. She folded the flyer and slipped it into her purse without quite knowing why. The following Saturday, she drove to the auction grounds. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking lot, while small groups gathered around folding tables where bidders registered. Sarah accepted her bidder's card and quietly stood near the back of the crowd. The auction moved quickly through old tractors, broken wagons, rusted gates, and weathered barns. Finally, the auctioneer lifted another clipboard. "Next item," he announced. 19th century horse stable located on the old Ashcroft property. Structure sold as is. Historic designation pending. Opening bid, $150. Silence settled over the crowd. A rancher in a denim jacket laughed softly. "You'll spend more replacing the roof than the whole place is worth." Another man shook his head. "Should have torn it down years ago." The auctioneer smiled patiently. "Any bids?" No hands rose. Sarah thought about the apartment she had left behind, the inheritance she had abandoned, and the strange feeling that her life had become little more than a collection of endings. She looked again at the photograph attached to the auction listing. The stable leaned slightly with age, but beneath the weathered boards, she noticed sturdy timber framing that had somehow survived more than a century. It looked forgotten rather than finished. Before doubt could overtake her, she raised her bidder's card. $150. The crowd turned toward her almost in unison. Someone chuckled. Another bidder whispered loudly enough for nearby people to hear. "Guess she likes expensive firewood." The auctioneer waited another moment before calling. "Any higher bids?" None came. "Sold." A few people actually applauded, amused that anyone had volunteered to own the collapsing structure. Sarah accepted the paperwork, and a heavy iron key attached to a faded leather tag stamped simply with the words Ashcroft Stable as she walked toward her car. Two older men exchanged sympathetic smiles. One called after her, "Hope you know a good carpenter." Sarah smiled politely but kept walking. She wasn't entirely sure she had made a sensible decision herself. The stable stood nearly an hour away along a narrow country road bordered by old stone fences and rolling pasture land. By late afternoon, she turned through an overgrown entrance where faded wooden posts leaned beneath climbing vines. The stable emerged beyond a cluster of ancient oak trees. It was larger than the auction photograph suggested. Long, weathered walls stretched across the property, interrupted by tall doors and narrow windows clouded with dust. Parts of the roof had sagged, and weeds grew around the foundation, yet the building still possessed a quiet dignity. Someone had built it with remarkable care. Sarah unlocked the heavy front doors. They opened slowly with a deep groan that echoed through the empty aisles. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating rows of abandoned horse stalls, worn feed bins, and thick wooden support beams darkened by age. Dust floated lazily through the still air. The faint scent of old hay lingered despite the years. She set down her small tool bag, found an old push broom leaning in one corner, and began sweeping the nearest aisle. Each stroke uncovered more of the original plank floor, hidden beneath layers of dirt and straw. As she cleared the first stall, something unusual caught her eye. Carved into one support beam was the outline of a small horse's head, enclosed within a circle. Curious. She continued sweeping farther down the stable. Another stall revealed the same carefully carved emblem, then another. By the time she reached the far end of the aisle, Sarah had counted the identical horse symbol carved into several different wooden beams, each one placed with deliberate precision, as though someone long ago had wanted future visitors to notice a mark no one had bothered to explain. The following morning, Sarah returned to the stable carrying a thermos of coffee, a toolbox, heavy work gloves, and a notebook where she intended to record every repair she could afford to make. The rising sun revealed details she had barely noticed the evening before. Ivy climbed portions of the outer stone walls. Several window shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. Rain gutters had collapsed in places, allowing years of water to stain the weathered timber beneath the roofline. The building clearly needed far more work than one person could complete quickly. Yet nothing about it suggested neglect during its early years. Every beam had been carefully fitted. Every stall had been built with unusual craftsmanship. Even the stone foundation remained remarkably level despite its age. Sarah unlocked the large front doors and stepped inside. Morning light poured through the dusty windows, making the stable feel less abandoned than it had the previous afternoon. She began by opening every door and window she could manage, allowing fresh autumn air to sweep away years of stale dust. Then she resumed cleaning, working methodically from one stall to the next. Broken buckets, rusted horseshoes, cracked feed bins, and rotten boards slowly formed neat piles outside. Whenever she uncovered another wooden support beam, she paused to look for the carved horse emblem. Every stall along the oldest section of the stable displayed the same carefully carved symbol. The marks were nearly identical in size and style, suggesting they had all been made by the same skilled hand. She sketched one into her notebook before returning to work. By midday, she heard the sound of a pickup truck stopping outside. A man in his late 30s stepped through the open doorway carrying a tape measure and a carpenter's level. He removed his cap politely before speaking. "You must be the new owner." Sarah smiled. "I suppose that's me." "Jack Mercer." He extended his hand. "I own the restoration shop a few miles down the road. Folks in town said somebody actually bought the old Ashcroft stable. I had to see it for myself." Sarah laughed softly. "I'm starting to think everyone knows about my questionable financial decisions." Jack grinned. "That auction caused quite a bit of conversation." He glanced upward toward the sagging roof. "Mind if I take a quick look? I'm curious how much of this place is still sound." Sarah welcomed the help. Jack walked slowly through the stable, examining support posts, rafters, joints, and stonework with practiced eyes. Occasionally, he tapped a beam with the handle of his hammer before making a thoughtful note on a small pad. After nearly 20 minutes, he returned to the center aisle. "The roof needs attention before winter," he said. "A few rafters have shifted, but the main frame is surprisingly solid. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing." "Can it be saved?" Sarah asked. Jack nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. It'll take work, but I've restored buildings in worse shape." Sarah admitted that her budget was almost non-existent. Jack looked around once more before answering. "Let's start with the dangerous spots first. We can worry about the rest later." That afternoon, they reinforced several weakened roof braces using reclaimed lumber Jack had brought from another project. It wasn't a permanent repair, but it stabilized the most vulnerable section enough to continue working safely. Sarah thanked him repeatedly. Jack only shrugged. "I'd rather help save an old building than watch it collapse." As they finished, another visitor arrived. An elderly man with silver hair and a walking stick approached slowly along the gravel drive. Jack smiled immediately. "Perfect timing. Sarah, this is Owen Harris." Owen removed his hat politely. I heard someone finally opened the stable again. Sarah invited him inside. The older man stood quietly in the center aisle for several moments before speaking. Hasn't changed as much as I expected. His eyes wandered across the empty stalls with unmistakable affection. I worked around horses most of my life. Never here exactly, but close enough to know this place had quite a reputation once. Sarah asked what he remembered. Owen walked slowly toward one of the oldest stalls. When I was a boy, old-timers still talked about the Ashcroft stable. Not because it was the biggest, because people said the finest horses in the county spent time here before anyone else recognized their quality. Racehorses? Sarah asked. Owen smiled faintly. Some racers, some workhorses, some breeding stock. Depends on which story you believed. The stable supplied horses across the county for many years. He rested one hand gently against a worn wooden partition. Funny thing is, most people remember the wealthy estates nearby. Hardly anyone remembers the folks who actually cared for the animals every day. Sarah thought about the carved horse symbols. Have you ever seen these before? She showed him one of the beams. Owen leaned closer, studying the carving carefully. I have. What does it mean? He frowned thoughtfully. I'm afraid I don't know. I remember seeing the symbol years ago, but no one ever explained it to me. The answer disappointed Sarah slightly. But Owen's recognition confirmed the carvings were not accidental decorations. Before leaving, he wished her luck. You've bought yourself a beautiful piece of history, he said. Don't let anyone convince you it's only an old stable. After both men departed, the building felt unusually quiet again. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon cleaning the oldest row of stalls where the carved horse emblems appeared most frequently. She removed broken planks, swept away compacted straw, and scraped decades of dirt from the original wooden flooring. As she worked inside one corner stall, something caught her attention. Her broom produced a noticeably different sound near the back wall. Instead of the dull scrape she had heard everywhere else, one section answered with a hollow knock. She stopped sweeping and tapped the area again using the wooden handle. Hollow. She knelt to inspect the floor more closely. At first, nothing looked unusual. The boards appeared just as worn as the rest of the stable. She brushed away another layer of packed dirt with her gloved hand. Beneath years of hardened dust, she uncovered a narrow outline where one section of flooring fit together more precisely than the surrounding boards. Someone had intentionally concealed it. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she continued clearing the dirt from the edges until a small patch of rusted metal emerged near one corner. She reached down and brushed away the remaining soil. An old iron pole ring slowly appeared beneath her fingertips, nearly invisible after decades hidden beneath straw and dirt. Sarah wrapped both hands around the cold metal, took a careful breath, and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a faint groan from deep beneath the floor, the concealed trapdoor shifted ever so slightly. Early the next morning, Sarah called Jack before attempting to open the trapdoor again. She described the concealed floor, the rusted pull ring, and the slight movement she had managed before stopping. Jack arrived less than an hour later carrying a pry bar, a flashlight, 2 lanterns, and a coil of sturdy rope. I'm glad you waited, he said after examining the floor. If someone's hidden something beneath here for this long, there's no reason to rush the last few minutes. Sarah agreed. They spent nearly half an hour clearing the remaining dirt from around the edges of the concealed door. Years of packed soil had hardened like cement, filling every narrow gap between the wooden boards. Jack carefully worked the pry bar beneath one corner, while Sarah steadied the iron ring. Together they applied slow, even pressure. At first, the trapdoor refused to move. Then old wood groaned deep below the floor. Dust drifted upward through the widening crack. There it goes, Jack said quietly. Another careful pull lifted the heavy door several inches. The hinges protested with a long, metallic scrape before settling open. Cool air rose from the darkness beneath the stable, carrying the faint smell of aged cedar and dry earth rather than the damp odor Sarah expected. She knelt beside the opening and aimed her flashlight downward. A sturdy wooden ladder disappeared into the shadows. "Looks dry," Jack observed after shining his own light below. "That's a good sign." Sarah hesitated only briefly before climbing down. Jack followed close behind, lowering one lantern after the other. The cellar proved larger than either of them had imagined. Stone walls enclosed a long underground room extending beneath several horse stalls. Thick ceiling beams supported the stable overhead. The space remained remarkably intact despite its age. Dust covered nearly every surface, yet very little moisture had reached the room over the years. Whoever built it had understood how to protect what was stored there. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Along one wall stood shelves holding cracked wooden crates, empty feed sacks, rusted harness hardware, and broken tools that had long since deteriorated beyond recognition. Several barrels had collapsed inward, spilling dark fragments across the stone floor. Old leather straps crumbled when touched. Time had reclaimed almost everything left in the cellar. Sarah felt both excitement and disappointment. She had hoped the hidden room might explain the mysterious horse carvings, yet much of what remained seemed too damaged to tell any story. Jack examined the stonework surrounding the cellar. "This wasn't added later," he said. "It was built as part of the original stable." Sarah swept her flashlight across the far end of the room. One object immediately stood apart from everything else. Against the back wall rested a tall cedar cabinet raised on a stone platform several inches above the floor. Unlike the ruined crates surrounding it, the cabinet appeared almost untouched. Its wood remained smooth beneath a layer of dust, and its brass hardware showed only light tarnish. Someone had taken extraordinary care to protect it from moisture. "That can't be a coincidence," Sarah whispered. They approached carefully. The cabinet doors were secured by a simple brass latch rather than a lock. Jack looked toward Sarah. "Your stable." She nodded and gently released the latch. The hinges opened almost silently. Inside, neat rows of leather-bound volumes rested on cedar shelves exactly as someone had placed them decades earlier. A faint scent of old paper and polished wood escaped into the cellar. Sarah stared without speaking. Every book appeared wrapped in protective cloth or stacked with deliberate precision. None had been thrown together in haste. Whoever closed these cabinet doors had expected the collection to remain hidden for a very long time. Jack carefully lifted one cloth covering. Beneath it rested a thick leather ledger with gold lettering still visible across its spine. Sarah leaned closer. The words were simple. Breeding Records. Another volume carried the same title, followed by a different year. Beside it rested additional ledgers arranged in sequence. Some were labeled Stud Book, others Veterinary Journal. Another shelf contained rolled documents tied with faded ribbon. Smaller boxes held envelopes stacked in careful order. "Someone preserved all of this on purpose," Jack said softly. Sarah reached toward the first ledger, then stopped herself. Years of working as an estate accountant had taught her to respect old records before touching them. "Let's be careful." She pulled a clean cloth from her bag and gently lifted the first volume onto a nearby work table built into the stone wall. Dust drifted into the lantern light as she slowly opened the cover. The pages inside were astonishingly well preserved. Elegant handwriting filled each line with dates, horse names, breeding information, owners, and detailed notes recorded in dark ink that had barely faded. Sarah turned another page. then another. Every entry reflected meticulous record-keeping. Whoever maintained these books had cared deeply about accuracy. Jack smiled. "Looks like you found more than an old storage room." Sarah nodded, still reading. The names meant nothing to her yet, but she immediately recognized the consistency of the records. These were not casual notes. They documented years of organized breeding history as she continued through the first ledger. One particular page caused her hand to stop. A beautifully written entry described the birth and early training of a stallion whose name sounded strangely familiar. She frowned, trying to remember where she had heard it before. Then it came to her. The same champion horse appeared on a bronze historical marker outside the prestigious Ashcroft estate several miles away. According to local history, that famous estate had produced one of the region's greatest bloodlines. Yet the ledger resting in Sarah's hands clearly listed the birthplace, early care, and breeding records beneath the name of the Ashcroft stable where she now stood. She looked at Jack in disbelief before slowly turning the book so he could read the heading himself. Neither of them spoke as they realized the first preserved breeding record beneath the forgotten stable credited a celebrated champion horse to an entirely different place than the history everyone believed. Sarah barely slept that night. She kept seeing the neat handwriting inside the breeding ledger and the familiar name of the champion stallion that every local history display credited to the neighboring Ashcroft estate, rather than the forgotten stable she now owned. She resisted the temptation to return to the cellar before sunrise. Whatever lay inside the cedar cabinet had remained hidden for generations. It deserved patience. The following morning she called her niece, Emma Whitmore, who was completing graduate research in agricultural history at a nearby university. Emma had always loved old documents, often spending weekends in archives while others chose vacations. If anyone could help preserve fragile records properly, it was her. Emma arrived shortly before noon carrying acid-free gloves, archival folders, pencils, and several storage boxes. Before Sarah led her underground, she explained everything from the county auction to the hidden trapdoor and the breeding ledger that challenged the accepted history of the region's most celebrated horses. Emma listened without interrupting, though her expression grew increasingly curious. When she finally stepped into the cellar, she stopped in front of the cedar cabinet and quietly whispered, "This is remarkable." Sarah smiled. "I thought you'd say that." They agreed on simple rules before touching another document. Nothing would leave the cellar until every item had been photographed and logged. Every ledger would be opened carefully. Every loose paper would remain in its original order. Emma created the first page of a handwritten inventory while Sarah gently carried one volume at a time to the stone work table. Their work moved slowly but steadily. The shelves contained far more than breeding ledgers. Thick veterinary journals recorded illnesses, treatments, recoveries, and careful observations stretching across decades. Separate books documented foaling dates, bloodlines, and breeding pairings with astonishing precision. Bundles of correspondence were tied together by year. Large rolled maps illustrated grazing fields, paddocks, and exercise tracks surrounding the stable long before modern roads crossed the countryside. Beneath another cloth covering, Emma discovered carefully mounted photographs. Though faded, many remained surprisingly clear. Stable hands stood proudly beside horses whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the ledgers. Trainers smiled from barn doors. Children sat on fence rails, while mares grazed in distant pastures. None of the people were identified by famous family names Sarah recognized from local history books. Instead, ordinary surnames appeared beneath nearly every photograph, written in neat ink that matched the ledgers. By late afternoon, the inventory already filled several pages. Sarah realized the cellar contained not simply records about horses, but the complete working history of generations of people who had cared for them. The following day, Owen Harris returned after Sarah invited him to see the discovery for himself. She guided him carefully down the ladder and watched his face as he looked around the hidden room. His eyes settled first on the cedar cabinet before moving toward the photographs Emma had arranged across protective cloths. Owen adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. "Well," he murmured, "I never thought I'd see these faces again." Sarah looked up immediately. "You recognize someone?" He nodded slowly and pointed toward one photograph showing 3 men standing beside a powerful bay stallion. "That fellow there is Thomas Greeley. My grandfather mentioned him many times. Folks said he could calm any horse with nothing but his voice." Owen moved to another photograph. "And this woman, that's Margaret Ellis. She was known for raising foals that hardly anyone else believed would survive." Emma checked the names against one of the breeding ledgers. They matched perfectly. Owen smiled sadly. "Funny how people disappear from history. My grandfather talked about them as though everyone knew their names. Now hardly anyone remembers they existed." Sarah retrieved several local history books she had borrowed from the county library earlier that morning. Together they compared the published accounts with the documents spread across the work table. The contrast became impossible to ignore. The books praised prominent estate owners and wealthy breeders while mentioning almost nothing about trainers, stable masters, caretakers, veterinary workers, or the families who appeared throughout the hidden archive. The champion horses remained the same. Many dates matched, yet the people credited for developing those bloodlines were entirely different. Emma quietly underlined several discrepancies in her notebook. The archive and the published history cannot both be completely accurate. Sarah turned another page of a breeding ledger. Every entry remained consistent with the surrounding records. No obvious contradictions appeared. Whoever kept these books had recorded routine details with the same care as major events, making fabrication seem highly unlikely. Jack stopped by later that afternoon to deliver additional lumber for temporary roof repairs. Sarah invited him downstairs after warning him to be careful near the ladder. He looked around in amazement before examining the rolled maps spread across the table. "This place just keeps getting bigger," he said. Emma smiled. "Not physically, historically." Jack laughed softly before helping them move several storage boxes away from one damp corner of the cellar. While lifting a narrow wooden crate from the bottom shelf of the cabinet, he noticed a folded sheet tucked behind it. "I think something slipped back here." Sarah carefully retrieved the paper. Unlike the ledgers, it had been folded several times before being placed behind the crate. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored paper. The ink had faded slightly, but remained easy to read. There was no signature visible at first. Instead, only a short message filled the page. Sarah read the opening lines aloud. "If these books are ever discovered before the proper time, protect them together. A single record can be questioned. The whole collection cannot." Emma looked toward the cabinet. "Whoever wrote this understood evidence." Sarah continued reading until she reached the final paragraph. Her voice grew quieter. "Hide every breeding book beneath the old stable until honesty returns." The 4 of them stood silently in the cellar, surrounded by shelves of carefully preserved records. Realizing that someone long ago had deliberately concealed the entire history of the stable not to preserve valuable horses, but to preserve the truth until someone willing to protect it finally opened the hidden room. Several days passed before Sarah allowed herself to read beyond the first shelves of the hidden archive. The excitement of the discovery had settled into a careful routine. Every morning she unlocked the stable, swept the center aisle, checked the temporary roof supports Jack had installed, and then joined Emma in the cellar. They photographed each document before opening it, recorded its condition, and returned it to exactly the same position on the cedar shelves. The work required patience, but neither woman wanted haste to damage records that had survived untouched for generations. As more volumes were cataloged, the stable gradually revealed itself not simply as a workplace, but as the heart of an entire community. The breeding ledgers were only one part of the story. Personal journals filled several shelves, each written by stable managers, trainers, caretakers, and family members whose lives revolved around the horses. Unlike the precise breeding records, these journals described ordinary days. They recorded long winters, difficult foaling seasons, celebrations after healthy births, worries over injured animals, and evenings when neighbors gathered inside the stable to share meals after exhausting days of work. Sarah found herself lingering over those pages far longer than she expected. One journal described stable hands taking turns sleeping beside a sick mare through an entire week until she recovered. Another recorded how neighboring families shared grain during a harsh season when feed became scarce. A young apprentice wrote proudly about earning permission to train his first colt without supervision. None of the entries sounded heroic. They simply revealed people who cared deeply about both the horses and one another. "You almost forget you're reading history," Sarah said quietly one afternoon. Emma nodded while turning another page. "Because they're writing about ordinary life. That's usually what disappears first." Owen continued visiting every few days. Sometimes he recognized surnames. Other times he remembered stories his grandfather had repeated when he was a child. As the journals uncovered more details about daily life, Owen filled small gaps with family memories that had never appeared in books. "My grandfather always said the best horsemen weren't the richest owners," he remarked one morning while studying an old photograph. "They were the people who noticed when something wasn't quite right before anyone else did." Sarah smiled. "These journals say almost exactly the same thing." Owen chuckled softly. "Then perhaps the old stories were true after all." Jack's restoration work also continued whenever his schedule allowed. True to his word, he concentrated first on safety rather than appearance. Loose roof sections were reinforced. Broken window frames were stabilized. Drainage around the foundation improved enough to keep future rainwater away from the cellar entrance. Sarah repeatedly insisted on paying him immediately, but Jack accepted only small amounts when she could spare them. "The stables waited over 100 years, he joked one afternoon while replacing damaged rafters. "It can wait another month for the rest." Sarah appreciated his kindness more than she knew how to express. For the first time since walking away from the inheritance, she no longer felt completely alone. Every person helping her seemed motivated by curiosity rather than personal gain. As the collection grew more organized, Emma began grouping documents by subject instead of simply by date. Veterinary journals occupied one shelf, foaling records filled another, photographs and correspondence each received their own carefully labeled boxes. While arranging one stack of breeding ledgers, Emma noticed a narrow, leather-bound volume resting horizontally beneath several larger books. Unlike the others, it carried no year on the spine. Dust covered the faded leather almost completely. She gently lifted it free and brushed away the surface dirt with a soft cloth. Gold lettering slowly appeared beneath her fingertips. "Master Registry." "Sarah," Emma called quietly. Sarah looked up from the work table. "What did you find?" Emma carefully carried the volume into the lantern light. It was noticeably thicker than the surrounding ledgers and secured with two worn leather straps. No decorative markings appeared beyond its title. The edges of the pages showed almost no wear, suggesting it had been opened far less often than the breeding books beside it. Owen adjusted his glasses as Sarah accepted the volume. "That sounds important." Sarah rested the registry on the table without opening it immediately. Instead, she examined the surrounding shelf more closely. The larger ledgers nearby covered decades of breeding activity already represented elsewhere in the archive. Yet the master registry occupied a separate position, almost as though someone wanted it protected even more carefully than the rest of the collection. Jack climbed down into the cellar carrying a replacement lantern just as Sarah loosened one of the leather straps. "Did I interrupt?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "Perfect timing." Sarah looked around the small group gathered inside the hidden room. Over the past weeks, they had uncovered journals, photographs, maps, veterinary records, breeding contracts, and the handwritten warning instructing future generations to hide every breeding book until honesty returned. Each discovery had answered one question while quietly raising another. Now the final unidentified volume rested before them. Sarah placed both hands lightly on its worn leather cover. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "someone wanted it to survive." The room fell silent as she slowly released the second strap and prepared to open the master registry for the very first time in generations. Sarah loosened the second leather strap and carefully lifted the heavy cover of the master registry. Unlike the breeding ledgers, the first pages contained no horse names. Instead, they displayed a handwritten introduction explaining the purpose of the volume. Emma leaned closer as Sarah read aloud. "This registry preserves the complete ownership and breeding history of every bloodline developed within these stables, together with supporting records should those histories ever be questioned." The handwriting matched the careful script found throughout much of the archive. Sarah slowly turned the next page. A detailed family chart connected horses recorded in the breeding ledgers to generations of mares and stallions raised within the stable. Every entry included dates, breeding notes, trainer names, veterinary references, and corresponding ledger numbers. Emma immediately recognized the system. Everything cross-references. Whoever created this expected someone to verify every claim. Sarah continued turning pages. Each section documented another celebrated horse whose bloodline had become well known across the county. Yet every one of them traced back to the forgotten stable rather than the prestigious neighboring estate credited in published histories. Attached beside several entries were folded contracts bearing signatures from buyers, breeders, veterinarians, and transport companies. Others included official registration certificates that matched dates recorded in the breeding books. There were no dramatic accusations, only orderly evidence. Jack looked over Sarah's shoulder. "It's like someone built an entire case without ever arguing." Emma nodded. "Because the documents do the talking." Near the center of the registry, Sarah discovered a section separated by heavier paper. Across the top, someone had written, "Transfer of ownership during financial hardship." She paused before reading further. The pages explained that after several years of severe financial strain, the families operating the stable struggled to maintain breeding operations. Wealthier estate owners gradually assumed legal ownership of horses, facilities, and contracts necessary to keep the breeding program alive. At first, the arrangements appeared temporary. The registry included agreements showing that stable workers continued caring for many of the horses even after ownership transferred on paper. But as the years passed, later registrations began listing only the estates while omitting the original breeders, trainers, and caretakers who had developed the bloodlines. Emma quietly opened one of the supporting folders stored beside the registry. Inside rested copies of veterinary reports, breeding contracts, and registration documents. Every paper reinforced the same sequence. Horses bred within the old stable eventually appeared in public records under different ownership, while the skilled workers who had raised them disappeared from official accounts altogether. Sarah felt sadness more than anger. "They didn't erase the horses," she said softly. "They erased the people." Owen, who had remained unusually quiet, slowly nodded. "That's what happens more often than folks realize. History remembers names with money. The hands that did the work fade away. They spent the remainder of the afternoon comparing the registry with previously cataloged ledgers. Again and again, the supporting evidence matched. Foaling records agreed with veterinary journals. Contracts matched breeding schedules. Photographs identified stable workers standing beside horses later celebrated elsewhere. The archive had not relied upon one remarkable document. It relied upon hundreds of ordinary records that quietly supported one another. Over the following week, Sarah and Emma created careful lists of family names appearing repeatedly throughout the archive. Whenever possible, Owen shared memories passed down through his grandfather. Several surnames still existed within neighboring towns. Others had disappeared decades earlier. Sarah began searching local directories, cemetery records, historical newsletters, and public archives, hoping to locate descendants who might recognize the forgotten names. Some inquiries reached dead ends. Others produced unexpected replies. One elderly woman remembered hearing stories about a grandfather who had trained horses before the family moved away. Another caller believed an old photograph stored in an attic might include people mentioned in the breeding journals. Each conversation strengthened Sarah's conviction that the archive belonged not only to history, but also to living families who had never known written proof of their ancestors' work still existed. As word quietly spread among a small circle of local historians and descendants, another visitor arrived at the stable one afternoon. A well-dressed man stepped from a dark pickup truck and introduced himself with a courteous handshake. "Richard Calloway," he said. "I own the horse farm a few miles east of here." Sarah recognized the name immediately. His farm was respected throughout the county for its modern breeding facilities. "It's nice to meet you," she replied. Richard glanced toward the stable roof, then across the surrounding property. "I've heard you've uncovered something rather interesting beneath this old building." Sarah smiled. Richard glanced toward the stable roof, then across the surrounding property. "I've heard you've uncovered something rather interesting beneath this old building." Sarah smiled politely. "We're still documenting everything." "Wise approach," he answered. "Rumors tend to grow faster than facts." He spoke calmly, showing genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. As Sarah gave him a brief tour of the restored portions of the stable, Richard explained that nearby landowners had discussed possible improvements to the surrounding area for several years. "Nothing finalized," he said, "but if this place receives historical attention, some of those conversations may have to slow down." There was no threat in his voice, only practical observation. Sarah appreciated his honesty. "I'd rather understand what we have before anyone makes decisions." Richard nodded. "So would I." Before leaving, he looked once more toward the weathered building. "Whatever you've found, I hope it's handled carefully. History deserves that." After he drove away, Jack set aside his hammer. "Seems reasonable enough," Sarah agreed. Richard had not tried to pressure her or dismiss the discovery. If anything, he seemed genuinely interested in seeing reliable evidence before reaching conclusions. That evening, Owen returned carrying a small wooden box he had found while sorting through belongings inherited from his grandfather years earlier. Inside rested several old horseshoes, a pocket knife, faded photographs, and a folded newspaper clipping. He handed the clipping to Sarah. It mentioned a county horse exhibition held decades ago, but contained little new information. Then Owen hesitated before speaking. "There is one thing my grandfather used to say that never made much sense when I was young." Sarah looked up. "What was that thing?" Owen gazed toward the center aisle where the hidden trapdoor lay concealed beneath the restored stall floor. Whenever people argued about which farm raised the finest horses, he'd simply smile and say, "The real story sleeps beneath the oldest stable." I always thought he meant it as a figure of speech. He slowly shook his hand, looking toward the cellar below. "Now I think he knew those books were hidden there all along." The days that followed settled into a rhythm Sarah had never expected to enjoy. Each morning she unlocked the stable before sunrise, swept the center aisle, checked the temporary roof repairs Jack had completed, and then joined Emma in the hidden cellar to continue cataloging the archive. What at first felt like an overwhelming discovery had gradually become careful, meaningful work. Every ledger, photograph, veterinary journal, breeding contract, and personal diary found its proper place in Emma's growing inventory. The hidden room no longer felt like a forgotten secret. It felt like a quiet library waiting patiently to tell its story. Sarah continued contacting families whose surnames appeared throughout the breeding records. Some letters received no reply, while others led to conversations lasting hours. Elderly residents remembered hearing fragments of stories from grandparents who had worked around horses but had never been mentioned in local history. Several younger descendants admitted they knew almost nothing about their family's connection to the stable. Sarah invited anyone interested to visit, explaining that the documents remained fragile but that she would gladly share copies of records relating to their ancestors. The first visitors arrived on a cool Saturday morning. A middle-aged couple carefully stepped through the stable doors, carrying a worn family album wrapped in cloth. The husband introduced himself as Daniel Foster. His great-grandmother's surname appeared several times in the breeding ledgers Emma had cataloged. Sarah welcomed them inside and guided them carefully to the work table above the cellar where copies of several documents had been prepared. Emma placed one breeding ledger beside a photograph discovered earlier in the week. Daniel stared silently at the page before pointing toward a familiar signature. "That's her handwriting," he whispered. "I've seen it in family letters." His wife covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. For years, they had believed their ancestors simply worked as hired help around horses. The archive showed something far greater. Margaret Foster had recorded breeding observations, supervised foaling seasons, and signed veterinary reports that influenced bloodlines celebrated throughout the county. "She mattered," Daniel said quietly. Sarah smiled gently. "She always did. Now everyone else can see it too." During the following weeks, more families arrived. Some brought faded photographs tucked inside old Bibles. Others carried letters, certificates, newspaper clippings, or handwritten family trees. Emma carefully compared every item against the archive. Again and again, the records supported one another. Faces matched names recorded in journals. Dates agreed with breeding ledgers. Stories passed quietly through generations suddenly found written confirmation beneath the old stable. Owen attended nearly every visit. Although his memory occasionally struggled with exact dates, he recognized surnames, family connections, and local traditions that helped descendants understand the lives their ancestors had lived. Watching those conversations reminded Sarah that history was never simply a collection of documents. It was people rediscovering where they belonged. One afternoon, a woman in her 70s arrived, carrying a small wooden frame protected inside a blanket. She explained that it had hung in her parents' home for decades without anyone paying much attention to it. Inside rested a faded photograph showing 6 stable workers standing proudly beside 2 young horses. Emma compared the faces with several photographs from the archive. 5 matched immediately. The 6th man had appeared only once before in a veterinary journal where he signed treatment notes for an injured mare. Owen smiled as recognition spread across the room. "That's Samuel Pierce," he said softly. "Grandfather always said he could judge a horse's health before anyone else noticed a problem." Sarah carefully photographed the framed picture before returning it, the woman's eyes filled with gratitude. "I never imagined anyone outside my family would care about this." "We do," Sarah replied, "because it completes the story." Jack's restoration work continued whenever he found spare time between other projects. He refused to let Sarah postpone repairs simply because money remained tight. "We'll finish this place one section at a time," he insisted while replacing damaged siding along the western wall. Sarah continued offering payment whenever she could, but Jack accepted only enough to cover materials. The stable slowly became safer without losing the character that had survived for more than a century. Watching him work reminded Sarah of the craftsman described throughout the journals. Care mattered more than speed. One evening, after another successful day of cataloging documents, Sarah and Jack sat on the stable porch overlooking the quiet pasture. Autumn leaves drifted across the gravel drive, while the fading sunlight warmed the old stone walls. Sarah admitted something she had been thinking for weeks. When I walked away from the inheritance, I thought I'd thrown away my future. Jack looked toward the stable before answering. Do you still believe that? She considered the question carefully. No. I don't have much money, but every morning I wake up knowing exactly why I'm here. Jack smiled. That's worth more than most people ever find. Sarah laughed softly. Funny. Everyone said buying this place was the worst decision I'd ever make. Looks like they underestimated you. She shook her head. They underestimated this stable. Their conversation ended comfortably, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. The building that had once seemed abandoned now echoed with quiet purpose. Families visited regularly. Emma's catalog continued growing. Owen's stories connected forgotten names to living memories. Even the weathered walls seemed less lonely than before. Several days later, Emma called Sarah into the cellar with unusual excitement. She had been reorganizing a stack of registration folders stored beside the master registry when she noticed one bundle wrapped separately from the others. The ribbon securing it had faded almost white with age, but a handwritten label remained visible across the front. Emma carefully untied the bundle and removed several official registration certificates bearing embossed county seals. Each certificate listed the earliest registration of horses that later became famous throughout the region. Sarah immediately recognized the names from the breeding ledgers. Emma compared the certificates with the surrounding records, then looked up in astonishment. These aren't copies, she said quietly. These are the original championship registration documents. Sarah accepted the top certificate with gloved hands. The registration clearly identified the birthplace, breeding history, and early ownership of one celebrated horse whose legacy had shaped generations of bloodlines. Every official detail pointed not toward the famous estate remembered by history, but toward the forgotten stable where she now stood. Sarah held the original championship registration certificate beneath the lantern light, while Emma carefully compared every line against the breeding ledgers and the master registry. The embossed county seal matched official records from the same period. Dates aligned perfectly with foaling journals. Trainer names corresponded with signatures preserved in veterinary reports. Even the registration number appeared again in a breeding contract filed decades earlier. Nothing stood alone. Every document reinforced another. Sarah slowly lowered the certificate onto the work table. The archive has been telling the truth from the beginning, she said quietly. Emma nodded. And now we have the official registrations to prove it. They spent the next several days examining the remaining certificates one by one. Each belonged to a horse that local history had celebrated for generations. Every one of those horses had been publicly associated with the prestigious neighboring estate. Yet the earliest registrations consistently identified the old stable as the place where the bloodlines had originated and where the horses had first been bred. Before later ownership transfers occurred during the financial hardships described in the master registry. Owen sat beside the work table, studying the certificates through his reading glasses. He smiled sadly. My grandfather used to say, great horses remember the hands that raised them, even if people don't. Sarah glanced toward the shelves filled with journals written by those forgotten caretakers. Maybe these records are finally helping people remember too. Emma carefully arranged copies of the certificates beside matching breeding ledgers, photographs, and veterinary journals. The evidence formed a complete sequence that could be followed from the birth of each horse through its later achievements. There were no unexplained gaps. Every stage of the story rested upon ordinary records preserved with extraordinary care. Jack continued strengthening the stable while the cataloging progressed. One afternoon, he completed repairs along the western wall and replaced several damaged boards near the entrance without disturbing the original timber wherever it remained sound. Standing back to examine his work, he smiled. "Feels like the building is standing a little taller." Sarah looked around the stable. Fresh air moved easily through repaired windows. The roof no longer sagged dangerously over the oldest stalls. Visitors could safely walk the center aisle without worrying about loose boards or unstable beams. The stable still looked historic, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked respected. More descendants continued arriving after hearing about the discoveries. Some stayed only an hour. Those spent entire afternoons comparing family stories with the documents Emma had carefully organized. Sarah welcomed each visitor personally. She explained that the original records remained protected in the cellar while copies could be handled upstairs. Families gathered around photographs, searching for familiar faces. Grandchildren listened as grandparents recognized surnames they had heard throughout childhood. Occasionally, someone laughed after discovering an ancestor's humorous journal entry. Just as often, quiet tears appeared when forgotten names resurfaced in official records after generations of silence. Sarah noticed that visitors rarely spoke first about famous horses. They spoke about people. They wanted to know where relatives had worked, what responsibilities they held, and whether their handwriting appeared anywhere in the journals. The archive had become something more personal than a collection of breeding documents. It had become a place where families rediscovered pieces of themselves. One afternoon, Richard Calloway returned to the stable after calling ahead to ask permission. Sarah greeted him warmly and guided him through the restored sections before showing him copies of several newly authenticated registration certificates. Richard studied them carefully without interrupting. He examined the breeding ledgers, the matching veterinary reports, and finally the original registration copies that connected every record together. After several minutes, he looked toward Sarah. "I understand now why you've been so cautious." "There's a lot here," she replied. Richard nodded. "Much more than rumors suggested." He spent another half hour quietly reviewing the organized displays Emma had prepared. Before leaving, he paused near the entrance. "Whatever happens next, I hope people recognize the difference between preserving history and simply owning old buildings." Sarah appreciated the comment. "So do I." Richard smiled politely before returning to his truck. Watching him drive away, Jack remarked, "Seems like he's starting to see what this place really is." Sarah agreed. The stable no longer looked like forgotten property waiting for redevelopment. It had become evidence of a history too important to overlook. As documentation continued, Emma contacted several respected agricultural historians and archivists, providing careful summaries of the collection without making exaggerated claims. Rather than asking them to accept conclusions, she invited them to examine the evidence themselves. Weeks later, the first responses arrived. The historians expressed strong interest in reviewing the archive because of the remarkable consistency among the breeding ledgers, journals, contracts, veterinary reports, photographs, and championship registrations. Sarah felt both encouraged and nervous. Until now, the discovery had remained largely within the local community. Soon, specialists would evaluate every document independently. She wanted the records judged honestly, exactly as the unknown keeper of the archive had intended. Several evenings before the expected visits, Sarah stood alone in the stable after everyone else had gone home. She slowly walked the center aisle beneath the repaired roof, pausing beside the stall where she had first discovered the concealed trapdoor. It was difficult to believe only a short time had passed since she stood there wondering whether buying the stable had been the worst mistake of her life. She thought about the inheritance she had abandoned, the laughter at the county auction, and the countless hours spent sweeping dust from forgotten floors. None of those moments seemed wasted anymore. Every difficult decision had quietly led her to this place. The following morning, Emma arrived carrying a large envelope marked with the official seal of the State Agricultural Heritage Society. She placed it carefully on the work table while Sarah and Jack looked on. "It came by certified mail," Emma said. Sarah opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. After reading the first paragraph, she looked up with quiet amazement. The State Agricultural Heritage Society formally requested permission to inspect the complete collection preserved beneath the historic stable. Recognizing that the archive might represent one of the most significant discoveries in the region's recorded horse breeding history, representatives from the State Agricultural Heritage Society arrived at the stable on a crisp autumn morning carrying document cases, cameras, archival gloves, and notebooks. Sarah welcomed them at the entrance with quiet confidence, though she could not hide her nervousness. For weeks, she and Emma had organized every ledger, journal, photograph, breeding contract, veterinary report, registration certificate, and personal diary so that each document could be traced to the next without confusion. The hidden cellar remained exactly as it had been found, except for improved lighting and protective coverings that allowed visitors to examine the collection without risking damage. Before anyone descended beneath the stable, Sarah explained how every item had been cataloged in its original location. The lead archivist smiled with genuine appreciation. "You treated this collection like professionals would have," she said. "That may be the reason it survived in such remarkable condition." Sarah thanked her quietly. She had simply done what seemed right. The examination lasted 2 full days. Specialists compared handwriting across journals and ledgers. They checked registration numbers against official county records. Veterinary reports were matched with breeding contracts. Maps aligned with property surveys preserved in local archives. Every question received another document as an answer. Emma carefully retrieved records whenever requested, while Sarah explained where each item had originally been stored inside the cedar cabinet. Jack remained nearby in case anyone needed assistance moving equipment, while Owen answered questions about local traditions and family stories that had survived through oral history. No one rushed. Every conclusion rested on evidence rather than assumption. Late on the second afternoon, the lead archivist gathered everyone inside the stable. She closed her notebook before speaking. "We've completed our preliminary review." Sarah felt her heartbeat a little faster. "The archive is authentic," the archivist continued. "Not only are the individual records genuine, but together they form one of the most complete collections of historic horse breeding documentation our society has examined. The consistency among the breeding ledgers, journals, contracts, veterinary records, photographs, and original championship registrations leaves very little room for doubt." Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment, overcome by relief. Emma reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Months of careful work had been worth every hour. The Society requested permission to continue preserving and studying the collection in partnership with Sarah rather than removing it from the stable. She accepted immediately. The archive had remained beneath those floors for generations. It belonged there as long as it could be protected properly. News of the authentication spread quickly through local newspapers, agricultural organizations, and historical societies. Families who had quietly followed the discovery now visited the stable in greater numbers. Descendants brought additional letters, photographs, family Bibles, and handwritten notes that helped expand the growing collection. Sarah welcomed every visitor personally. She never spoke as though she had uncovered the history herself. Instead, she introduced people to the records that had patiently waited for them beneath the stable. One Saturday, the county organized a public gathering inside the restored building. Temporary display panels featured copies of breeding ledgers, veterinary journals, photographs, and championship registrations, while the original documents remained safely protected. Visitors moved slowly through the exhibits. Elderly residents paused before familiar surnames. Young children asked grandparents about ancestors they had never known. Daniel Foster stood quietly beside the breeding records signed by his great-grandmother, Margaret. Several other descendants recognized family photographs for the first time. Owen smiled as he watched generations meet one another through history rather than memory alone. During the presentation, agricultural historians explained how the archive demonstrated that many of the region's most celebrated bloodlines had originated in the forgotten stable, before later ownership transfers shifted public recognition elsewhere. The presentation avoided blame. Instead, it focused on restoring the contributions of trainers, caretakers, breeders, veterinary workers, and stable families whose knowledge had shaped generations of remarkable horses. The audience responded with thoughtful silence, followed by warm applause. Sarah stood near the back of the stable, grateful that the document spoke more powerfully than she ever could. In the weeks that followed, local organizations began discussing updated historical displays, educational materials, and permanent recognition for the forgotten breeders whose names filled the ledgers. The conversations no longer centered only on famous horses. They centered on the ordinary people whose patience, skill, and dedication had created those bloodlines. One afternoon, Richard Calloway returned to the stable after requesting a private meeting with Sarah. They walked slowly through the center aisle while sunlight filtered across the repaired wooden beams. Richard looked around thoughtfully before speaking. "I've spent the last few weeks reading the reports from the Heritage Society." Sarah waited quietly. "Your discovery changes how people understand this place," he continued. "Any development plans affecting the stable or the surrounding historic grounds would no longer make sense." He smiled politely. "I've officially withdrawn my company's interest in pursuing those projects." Sarah nodded with sincere appreciation. "Thank you." Richard glanced toward the restored stalls. "Some places deserve preservation more than progress. I believe this is one of them." After he left, Jack joined Sarah outside beneath the old oak trees. "Looks like the stable's future is a little safer now." "Yes," Sarah replied. Yet another decision still remained. Several museums and historical organizations quietly approached her with generous offers to purchase the stable or relocate the archive to larger facilities with more resources. The proposals were practical and well-intentioned. Climate-controlled storage, professional staff, and larger exhibition spaces all offered clear advantages. Sarah considered every possibility carefully. Then she walked alone through the stable one evening after the last visitors had gone home. She paused beside the weathered horse stalls, touched the carved horse emblems she had discovered on her very first day, and finally descended into the hidden cellar. The cedar cabinet stood almost exactly as it had when she first opened it, though many shelves now held protective archival boxes. While checking one of the lower compartments, she noticed a small envelope tucked neatly behind several empty folders. She was certain it had not been there before, hidden by the larger volumes that had only recently been removed for preservation. The envelope was sealed with faded wax and addressed in careful handwriting. Across the front, in the same elegant script she recognized from earlier letters, were the words, "To whoever chose this stable over fortune." Sarah carefully lifted the unopened envelope into the lantern light, realizing that after everything the archive had already revealed, one final message had been waiting patiently beneath the old stable all along. Sarah carried the sealed envelope upstairs and placed it carefully on the same wooden table where she and Emma had spent months organizing the hidden archive. Evening sunlight streamed through the restored windows, casting warm light across the old timber beams. Emma, Jack, and Owen gathered quietly beside her. None of them hurried, Every important discovery beneath the stable had rewarded patience, and this final letter deserved the same respect. The faded wax seal broke cleanly beneath Sarah's careful hand. Inside rested a single folded sheet of thick paper, preserved as perfectly as the ledgers that had surrounded it for generations. She unfolded the letter slowly and began reading aloud. "If these words have reached you, then the stable has found the right keeper. We did not hide these books because the horses were valuable. Horses live honest lives, whether history remembers them or not. We hid these records because people deserve the truth about the hands that shaped those bloodlines. Wealth changes ownership. Time changes memory. But careful records can outlive both." Sarah paused briefly before continuing. "If you discovered this archive after choosing honesty instead of fortune, then you already understand what we hoped someone would one day learn. Do not use these records to shame those who came later. Let the evidence speak without anger. Restore forgotten names with kindness, and history will correct itself. The stable was never meant to belong to the richest family. It belongs to everyone who believes faithful work deserves to be remembered." The room remained silent after she finished reading. No one spoke for several moments. Owen slowly removed his hat and looked toward the cellar entrance. "Your keeper got exactly what he hoped for," he said softly. Emma carefully placed the letter into an archival sleeve before resting it beside the earlier, handwritten warning they had discovered weeks before. Together, the two messages completed the story. The hidden archive had never been created to protect valuable horses, secret fortunes, or forgotten property. It had been preserved to protect ordinary people whose knowledge, patience, and skill had quietly shaped generations of remarkable bloodlines until history was finally ready to remember them during the months that followed. The State Agricultural Heritage Society worked alongside Sarah, Emma, and local volunteers to preserve every document beneath the stable without removing the collection from its original home. Climate-controlled cabinets were carefully installed inside renovated rooms. The underground cellar remained protected as part of the historical exhibit, allowing visitors to see where the records had survived untouched for generations. Jack supervised restoration work throughout the building, replacing only those structural timbers that could no longer be saved whenever possible. Original beams remained in place, including every carved horse emblem Sarah had discovered on her first day. The stable retained its age, its character, and its quiet dignity. Descendants continued donating family photographs, journals, certificates, and personal letters that expanded the archive without changing its story. Emma coordinated research with universities and agricultural historians, carefully documenting every new contribution. Owen visited almost daily, greeting visitors with stories passed down from his grandfather and smiling whenever children asked questions about the old stable. Before long, the county unveiled a new historical marker near the entrance to the property. Unlike earlier displays that focused primarily on famous estates and celebrated owners, the new inscription honored the breeders, trainers, stable masters, caretakers, veterinary workers, apprentices, and families whose names had filled the hidden ledgers beneath the stable floor. Hundreds of forgotten names stood together in carved stone for the first time. During the dedication ceremony, descendants gathered beside visitors who had traveled from neighboring counties to witness the unveiling. Daniel Foster quietly placed flowers beneath the marker honoring his great-grandmother, Margaret. Several elderly residents recognized family surnames they had never expected to see publicly acknowledged. Teachers brought students to explain how careful records and ordinary lives could reshape accepted history. Sarah stood near the back of the gathering, content to watch. She never sought recognition for herself. The archive had always belonged to the people whose voices filled its pages. She had simply opened the door. A few weeks later, The county formally designated the Ashcroft Stable as a permanent horse heritage museum and research center dedicated to preserving the region's breeding history. The State Agricultural Heritage Society offered Sarah the position of permanent curator, trusting the person who had protected the collection from the beginning to continue caring for it in the future. She accepted without hesitation. There had been a time when she believed walking away from $2 million meant abandoning her future. Now she understood that she had been choosing something she could not yet see. Her days settled into a peaceful routine. Each morning she unlocked the stable before visitors arrived. School groups wandered through carefully restored stalls, while researchers examined copies of breeding ledgers in quiet reading rooms. Families searched the archives for familiar names. Children pointed excitedly toward the carved horse emblems on the old support beams, while Sarah explained that some of history's greatest stories begin with people whose names almost disappear. Jack continued helping with maintenance whenever repairs became necessary, refusing to let the building lose the character that had survived more than a century. Emma remained closely involved with ongoing research and cataloging, ensuring every new donation strengthened the growing collection. Owen often welcomed visitors before Sarah arrived, treating the stable almost as though he had finally come home himself. One evening, long after the last guests had departed, Sarah sat alone on the front porch overlooking the quiet pasture where horses had once grazed. The restored stable stood behind her, warm light glowing softly through its windows. She thought about the courthouse where she had signed away a fortune. At the time, everyone believed she had thrown her life away. They measured wealth by bank accounts, property values, and legal victories. None of them could have imagined that $150 spent on a forgotten stable would give her something far richer. She had found purpose where others saw ruin. She had found community where others expected loneliness. Most of all, she had helped return generations of forgotten breeders, trainers, and caretakers to the history they had earned through quiet dedication rather than public recognition. The fortune she walked away from would have purchased comfort. The stable she chose instead gave her a home, friendships, and a life's work built upon truth instead of inheritance. As the evening breeze moved gently through the old oak trees, Sarah looked once more at the weathered building whose hidden cellar had patiently guarded its records until the right person finally opened the door. She smiled, grateful that the greatest legacy waiting beneath those worn wooden floors had never been about valuable horses or lost wealth. It had always been about remembering the ordinary people whose faithful hands built something extraordinary, and ensuring that, at last, history remembered them too. Sarah's journey reminds us that the greatest treasures are rarely measured in dollars. Wealth can provide comfort, but integrity, purpose, and the courage to choose what is right leave a legacy that lasts far longer than money ever could. The forgotten stable stood silent for generations, waiting not for the richest owner, but for someone willing to value truth over profit. In the same way, every family, every community, and every ordinary person carries stories that deserve to be remembered. Sometimes history isn't changed by grand heroes or famous names. It is restored by one person who refuses to let the past be forgotten. If this story touched your heart, may it remind you to treasure the people who came before you, to preserve the stories that might otherwise disappear, and to remember that the most meaningful inheritance we can leave behind is not fortune, but honesty, compassion, and a legacy that helps others remember where they came from.